The title of my talk today is Berkeley Mayor J. Stitt Wilson's Social Crusade. Stitt Wilson and his family were very interesting local people, and I have stories about them that I hope you'll enjoy, but I wouldn't be working on his biography if that's all there was. He lived from 1868 to 1942, and that means that his adult life runs from the Gilded Age to the New Deal and World War II. From a time when people feared that corporate power and plutocratic rule would destroy democracy, to a time when decades of movements for social justice resulted in a new social contract that, for all its limits, created increasingly decent and democratic society in the 30 years after World War II. Stitt Wilson was a lifelong participant in a number of those social movements, and his history may have some value for us in our new Gilded Age. J. Stitt Wilson, Jackson Stitt Wilson, was mayor of Berkeley for only 2 years, from July 1911 through June of 1913. For most of his adult life, from the 1890s through the 1930s, he made his living through public speaking and described his profession as lecturer. He advocated for socialism, drawing on what came to be called the social gospel, and he influenced a great many people, directly or indirectly. Kurt Vonnegut, who many of you have heard of, was often asked about the source of his political beliefs, and he usually responded by telling a story about a labor activist he got to know after he returned home from World War II. Powers Hapgood was called as a witness in a case about violence on a picket line, and the judge asked him, what was a Harvard graduate and a man from a good and well-to-do family doing spending his life on picket lines? And Hapgood replied, why, the Sermon on the Mount, sir. Vonnegut commented that this summed up his own beliefs as well, and this is certainly the social gospel in a nutshell. And how did Powers Hapgood learn about it? I'm sure you can see this coming. While attending Harvard, he joined the Young Men's Christian Association, and in the summer of 1919, he went to a YMCA conference, where, according to his diary, he was deeply moved by a speech by J. Stitt Wilson and decided to dedicate his life to working for the oppressed. So who was J. Stitt Wilson? What did he believe? How did he come to Berkeley? What did he do in the 40 years he lived here? Obviously, I have time only for a few high points. I'm going to focus on his work for socialism, leaving out most of his work for women's suffrage, prohibition of alcoholic beverages, alternative medicine, educational reform, and tax reform. Also leaving out much of his personal and family life, much of the detail of his beliefs, and the sources he drew on for his beliefs. But feel free to ask about these things after the talk. There's going to be plenty of time for questions and discussion, and I have a lot of information on some of these things, and others I'm still busy researching. Jackson Stitt Wilson was born in 1868 on the Canadian side of Lake Huron, the third of 12 children. His father worked as a shoemaker and farmer and was very active in the Methodist Church. At the age of 21, Stitt Wilson married Emma Agnew, who also came from a deeply religious Methodist family, and the next year the two of them moved to Evanston, Illinois. There he studied for the Methodist ministry, served as an assistant pastor in several churches, and attended Northwestern University. Also living in Evanston and attending Northwestern with him at various times were his younger brother Ben Wilson, who also became a Methodist minister, several of his wife's brothers, two of whom became officers in the Salvation Army, and her sister Leela, who later married Ben Wilson. Years later, Wilson described his pastoral experience at a church in a poor working-class district of Chicago. I have buried children who did not have enough rags to cover them in their coffins. I have slept with men to keep them from committing suicide. I have seen the great armies of the unemployed live worse than animals, hungry in the streets when the masters of business could no longer profit from their labors. In 1897, he graduated from Northwestern, received full ordination as a Methodist minister, and proceeded to resign from the ministry to found the Social Crusade along with 3 other ministers, including his younger brother Ben. They were deeply impressed by the kingdom movement, which argued that God's kingdom should be on earth as it is in heaven, and that the application of Christianity to society required an economy based not on competition, but on cooperation, the cooperative commonwealth. I'm going to quote from a speech that J. Stitt Wilson gave to a group of Methodist ministers. It's only a small part, but it gives a flavor of that view. The Church of Christ cannot dare to make human souls so infinitely valuable on Sunday in the church and at the altar, and then make them so cheap and worthless on Monday on the highways and at the factory gates. Have you any Monday translation for your Sunday spirit and gospel? Have you any factory and mill version for your prayer meeting passion for souls? Have you any social and industrial organization that will constitute a material expression, an incarnation of the Sermon on the Mount, the Golden Rule, and the divine love for man that radiates from Calvary? You pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven" on Sunday. Can we form a social system that looks as if we meant that for all the weekdays? On Sunday you pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Can we use land, labor, and machinery in such a manner from Monday to Saturday so as not to defeat the very Almighty in answering that prayer? So far as this generation is concerned, the answer to this question is summed up in one word. That word is socialism. Socialism is real Christianity in overalls. The Social Crusaders held meetings on the streets and in the churches in Chicago and in small towns and cities throughout the Midwest, and they published a monthly magazine. Their talks often received substantial newspaper coverage. I want to read one excerpt from among dozens from the Evening News of Benton Harbor, Michigan, September 2nd, 1898. The closing addresses of the series given by the leaders of the Social Crusade will be given tonight at the bicycle track. Mayor Brandt will preside, and good orchestra music is offered for the occasion. One feature worth the visit and spending an entire evening at the track will be the rendition of the chariot races from Ben-Hur by the Reverend Thad Fritz, one of the Crusaders. For years a teacher of elocution in several of the leading colleges of the United States, he is a master of the art and has only given it up to devote his life to the Social Crusade work. Reverend J. Stitt Wilson will deliver his popular Lyceum lecture on the sublime task of the 20th century, delivered at Battle Creek to 2,500 people at the Tabernacle. Mr. Wilson held the championship in forensic oratory at Northwestern University and was the instructor in oratory at that institution last year. Those who have listened to him night after night on the streets pleading the cause of humanity need not be told that he is a good speaker. I want to point out a couple of things about this article. First, the emphasis on the spoken word as performance and public entertainment in the era before radio, let alone television. A background which perhaps explains how all 3 of Wilson's children that survived into adulthood developed tremendous theatrical skills, which will be mentioned later. Second, the article treats this meeting as a celebration of American idealism. It's not hostile. It's not a socialist newspaper. It's your regular town newspaper. But alongside of the fear of growth from the trusts and plutocracy was great optimism that the growing forces of the economy could create prosperity for all if only they could be harnessed to Christian values. Socialism was feared by some, but it was widely regarded as one of those optimistic ideas. You'll note that the mayor of Benton Harbor presides at the meeting, even though he's not a socialist. It's a widely respected point of view. In 1900, the Social Crusaders were very excited to join with George Heron, who was the leader of the Kingdom movement, and with his supporters, who included a wealthy patron. The expanded and better funded group had the ability to reach out beyond the Midwest, and the Social Crusader magazine went to an improved format and doubled in size. A few months later, Heron divorced his wife and married the daughter of his patron. This was totally unacceptable to church-going Christians of the time and discredited the Social Crusade in the Midwest. Stitt Wilson took the crusade to the West Coast, speaking throughout Oregon and California, and moved his family to Los Angeles. Most of the original Social Crusaders came west with him. Stitt Wilson mostly toward Southern California, his brother Ben Wilson toward Northern California, and settled in Berkeley. In 1902, Leila Agnew, Emma Wilson's sister, came out from Evanston to Berkeley and married Ben Wilson. Later that year, Stitt Wilson also moved to Berkeley. He purchased a large house at the head of Ridge Road with a spectacular view out over the bay. It was one of a group of 4 neighboring houses designed by Bernard Maybeck. It's one of the first houses that Maybeck ever designed. He'd begun with the Charles Keeler house, and which were intended to demonstrate how to design homes that fit into their natural environment. So I think the fact that that's the house that Stitt Wilson chose to buy shows something about kind of the nature and interests of the man. Now, how did an itinerant socialist preacher, in effect, manage to buy a Maybeck house, aside from the fact that Maybeck wasn't quite famous back then? He was, but nonetheless, it wasn't cheap to buy a house either. Well, both Wilson families moved into the house. And for the next 4 years, it was the home to Stitt and Emma Wilson and their 4 children, and Ben and Leila Wilson and their child, and the widowed Mrs. Eliza Agnew, who was the mother of Emma and Leila. So they pooled their resources. And with both Stitt and Ben Wilson engaged in constantly going on speaking tours, it was undoubtedly very helpful that all of the women were able to work together to maintain the household and help raise the children. The Socialist Party was organized in 1901 from 3 smaller groups, and over the next couple of years, the Social Crusade dissolved as a separate group. Ben Wilson became a member of the Socialist Party Speakers Bureau and did lecture tours throughout the U.S. Stitt Wilson gave regular Sunday socialist sermons in San Francisco and made frequent tours of Southern California. It was not an easy life, and in September 1905, Stitt Wilson succumbed to the idealization of a quiet rural life, despite having spent his childhood in that kind of a setting. And he bought a 5-acre ranch in Hemet, which is between Riverside and Palm Springs, complete with apricot and peach trees, 2 cows, several chickens, and 20 hives of bees. His life on the ranch lasted 4 months. In February 1906, he put the ranch up to sale and moved back to Berkeley. 2 months later, the San Francisco earthquake and fire, and Stitt Wilson did a speaking tour in Southern California to raise money for the earthquake victims and, as always, to raise the consciousness of his listeners. I want to quote a bit from his speech, at least the one that made the newspapers. We were thunderstruck to learn that perhaps 10,000 families and 150,000 people were rendered temporarily homeless, hungry, and destitute, and our hearts leaped to help. The soul of the nation was touched, and the purse responded. But a state of comparable homelessness, hunger, and destitution affects immeasurably more of our citizenship perpetually. Robert Hunter's recent book on poverty says that in recent prosperous times, no less than 10 million people in the United States are underfed, underclothed, and poorly housed. Does this arouse us, or are we only aroused by a calamity caused by nature? We call a natural calamity a terrible disaster, but the poverty and want of 10 million people caused by social injustice We call even such names as prosperity and national well-being. While he was touring the Midwest in 1899 and 1900, Stitt Wilson had also taken time out, along with a couple of the other ministers, and had visited England, where they spoke on Christian socialism and they observed the formation of the British Labour Party. Friends from these visits invited him to come and lecture at their Christian Socialist Summer Institute in Wales. So in mid-1907, Stitt Wilson and his family moved to England. There he enjoyed great success, speaking before audiences that sometimes numbered in the thousands, and he stayed there for the next 2 years. With Stitt Wilson in England, his brother Ben and his family moved from Berkeley to Girard, Kansas, which was headquarters of the nationally circulated socialist newspaper, The Appeal to Reason, also the socialist women's magazine, Progressive Woman, and the Socialist Party Speakers Bureau. Stitt Wilson and his family returned to Berkeley from England in December 1909, and he resumed lecturing in California on behalf of the Socialist Party. While they were in England, his daughter Gladys Viola Wilson had joined a Shakespearean theater company under the stage name Viola Barry. She now moved to Los Angeles, where she had leading roles in local theater groups, took the initiative to put on a stage version of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and then quickly became a star in silent movies. In 1910, the Socialist Party selected Stitt Wilson as their candidate for governor, quite possibly because, having been away for 2 years, he was not implicated in the party's never-ending factional struggles. He toured the state in a red-painted automobile, and in November he received more than 12% of the vote, doubling the percentage the Socialists had received in 1906, and running well ahead of the rest of the Socialist ticket. With this showing, the Berkeley chapter of the Socialist Party eagerly recruited him to run for mayor. Now, you're all familiar with Berkeley's current council-manager form of government, but that only began with the Charter of 1923. The previous 1909 charter established a commission form of government in which each member of the city council also ran a city department, thus serving as both a legislator and an executive. The mayor was elected for a 2-year term, and 4 council members served staggered 4-year terms, so that every 2 years the mayor and 2 of the council members were up for election. In 1911, the incumbent Mayor Hodgehead and his allies on the city council and school board ran as the Good Government slate. They were opposed by a large field of independents and by a full slate of Socialist Party candidates. In the 2-person race for mayor, Stitt Wilson was elected outright on Saturday, April 1st, 1911. Note Saturday elections. What an idea. Only one of the 2 socialist candidates for council made the runoff. That was John A. Wilson, no relation to Stitt Wilson. He was the proprietor of a bicycle shop. And so did one of the 2 socialist candidates for school board, Herman Stern, a former minister and college professor who had moved to Berkeley and now worked in real estate. The 4 good government candidates for city council and school board all made the runoff and were favored to win. The socialists allied themselves with the two socialists who made the runoff allied themselves with the 2 independents who had made the runoff. And rather to the surprise of everyone, they won. Now, I need to fill you in on a peculiarity of the school board. The school board was composed of 4 elected school board members who ran for 4-year terms, with 2 of them coming up every 2 years, and 1 member of the city council, providing the 5th member of the school board. When the newly elected city council convened in July 1911, John A. Wilson was chosen as the council member who would sit on the school board, and this gave the coalition of socialists and allied independent a majority on both the council and the school board. With the elections over, Stitt Wilson and his son Gladstone and some friends all went hiking and camping in the Sierra for a week, checking out water company land that he hoped the public could acquire for a future public water company. Now, Berkeley at that time had very weak public services, to say the least. It had inadequate police and fire protection, an inadequate sewer system, unpaved streets, only a few parks, minimal aid to the poor, a minimal building code, no zoning, and had only recently started limited milk inspections, and there was a call for having inspections of meat. When the new city government tried to force the water company to lower its rates, the water company sued the city, and the city council determined that they didn't have enough money to defend themselves in court and settled for preventing further rate increases rather than for trying to pursue lowering the water rates. Taking office on July 1st, 1911, Stitt Wilson started in on a very ambitious program, but won approval of only a fraction of his proposals over the next 2 years. Majority support from the voters of Berkeley was not enough. He wanted to reform Berkeley's system of taxation, but to do so required a change in the California Constitution to allow local governments more flexibility. He wanted to have a publicly owned water supply and telephone service, but those required creation of multi-city utility districts. The East Bay Municipal Utility District, which provides our water, was only initiated in 1923 and finally started providing water in 1928, so it took a long time. He wanted a municipal electric plant and more public parks, but these required bond measures to be passed by a 2/3 vote of the citizens of Berkeley. And an effort at passing a bond measure only got something over 60% and failed. He did have some important successes. Stitt Wilson won the voters' approval to raise local taxes to support improved city services, and they did pass bonds to upgrade sewers and upgrade police and fire equipment. The city of Berkeley established only the second municipal employment office in California, and it leased a house on the corner of Center and Milvia Streets to be run by the Charity Commission to provide a place for homeless people to sleep. During an electrical workers' strike, he had Berkeley's police follow the armed strikebreakers hired by PG&E to ensure that they did not intimidate strikers and their supporters. Stitt Wilson also proved himself to be an astute politician who knew how to appeal to a wide range of voters. He instituted a spotless town campaign, which went after lots and yards overgrown with weeds, which were both a fire hazard and an eyesore. The city council passed an ordinance providing for fines on such properties, but he focused on voluntary compliance with an annual Spotless Town Campaign Week that generated wonderful newspaper photos of the mayor and the police chief and other city employees cutting weeds along with neighboring homeowners. He also worked on park beautification and involved school children in learning about plants and planting flowers in the parks, which resulted in charges from some of the more revolutionary socialists that he was endorsing child labor. 8 months into his term in February 1912, the school board majority, composed of socialists John Wilson and Herman Stern and the independent Eleanor Carlisle, refused to renew the contract of the current superintendent of schools. The superintendent's supporters in the community protested and gathered enough signatures to force an April recall election for the 3 school board members, which would include recalling John Wilson from the city council. It appears that the socialists were more concerned with vocational education for the vast majority of students who would not go on to college, while Superintendent Frank Bunker may have been more focused on those going on to college. But it's actually hard to tell what the content of the conflict was. The driving force was clearly a personality clash between Bunker and Carlisle. Bunker knew himself to be a distinguished educator, generally credited with the invention of the middle school, and he expected to be treated with deference for his expertise. Eleanor Carlisle was the socially prominent founder and leader of the Mothers Clubs of the Bay Area, the precursor to the PTAs. She was a strong women's suffrage supporter, and she was not about to defer to anyone. The recall changed the conflict from personalities and education issues to control over the city government. Stitt Wilson said that Bunker was, quote, a good man, but the school board got to choose the superintendent, and he opposed the recall as an attack on socialism. The campaign was a heated one. Supporters of Bunker followed the mayor as he drove around town speaking against the recall at street corners, trying to speak in support of the recall to the crowds that gathered to hear the mayor. At one point, members of a crowd in West Berkeley threw rocks at the car full of people who were supporting the recall, and they proceeded to charge Stitt Wilson in court with inciting the crowd to riot. The recall failed overwhelmingly on election day, with 3,900 votes in support and 5,700 votes in opposition. Even as he worked on Berkeley issues, he campaigned for two major changes to the state constitution. He campaigned tirelessly for an equal suffrage amendment, which was passed in October 1911, giving women in California the right to vote. I won't go into any detail on that here because it's the subject of my forthcoming article, and the Historical Society can email you a copy if you're interested. I have just a couple of them here as well. He followed this with a campaign in 1912 to change the California Constitution to give local governments such as Berkeley's the power to tax land at a higher rate than buildings. Land value taxation was a major social movement at the time, typically referred to as the single tax movement, because its founder, Henry George, argued that no other tax was needed or should be used to support government at all levels. Henry George argued that government should not tax consumption, which raises the cost of living, nor should it tax productive activity, such as constructing buildings. Instead, government should tax the land, which was the creation of God and not of the person who claimed ownership of it, and whose value came from the surrounding city and its people, and not from anything that the owner of the land did. In Stitt Wilson's words, the wealth the individual creates should go to the individual. The values which are created by the social body should go to the social body. A longer statement of his views is on the back of the handout that many of you have picked up over on the table there, and there's more if you missed one. While helping lead the campaign for home rule taxation, Stitt Wilson also ran for Congress. In November 1912, he received 40% of the vote, while Joseph Nolan, the incumbent Republican, received 54%. Home rule taxation also failed, receiving 41% of the vote statewide. About the only positive news was his brother Ben was elected to the Kansas State Legislature from Girard, Kansas. 2 weeks later, his wife Emma and youngest child, 7-year-old Arnold Melnott Wilson, came down with diphtheria, for which there was at the time no vaccine and no treatment. Emma recovered, but Melnott died on November 30th. The Socialist Party nominated him to run for re-election in February 1913, but he declined. His widely republished letter to the Socialist Party gave as his reason the opposition of the non-socialist city council majority to his socialist measures. This has been accepted at face value by those writing about him up till now, but it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because he was coming up to an election, and both the council members who were up for re-election were non-socialists, so election of one more socialist to the council would have given him a majority. I think it much more likely that he declined to run because he was exhausted from continuous campaigning, his recent electoral defeats, and in particular because he was overcome with grief over the death of his son and unable to imagine himself continuing to deal with the minutiae of city government. Stitt Wilson did speak on behalf of the socialist ticket in 1913, and his brother Ben joined in the campaign and soon moved his family back to a house in North Berkeley, foregoing possible additional terms in the Kansas State Legislature. But with Stitt Wilson out of the race, the Socialist Party did not do well. Its only successful candidate was Elvira Beals, who was elected to the school board, giving the Socialists 2 more years of a majority there. Philo Phelps, the retired minister and candidate for mayor, didn't even make the runoff. One socialist candidate for city council did make the runoff, and though he was not elected, I just want to mention him. Fyodor Postnikov was not only a civil engineer working in Berkeley, but a former lieutenant colonel in the Tsarist army. He had been in charge of balloon warfare in Vladivostok during the Russo-Japanese War, and when Vladivostok erupted in revolution in 1905 after Russia lost the war, he moved to America rather than be used by the Tsar to put down the uprising. He became an American citizen, joined the Socialist Party, and was involved in radical causes for the next 20 years. And judging by the way his son writes about this in the family biography, somewhat to the embarrassment of his family. When Stitt Wilson's term ended in July 1913, he declared a new social crusade and toured California on behalf of the Socialist Party, campaigned statewide for the California Dry Federation, which had measures to bring about prohibition of alcohol in November 1914 and November 1916. And his son, William Gladstone Wilson, toured with him during the dry campaigns, doing the driving, sharing speaking duties, and doing some public speaking on his own in the East Bay. In 1915, Stitt Wilson, with evidently his energy for local politics back, ran for mayor again. He made the runoff, but received only 38% of the vote against Samuel Irving, a conservative businessman. Incumbents John A. Wilson and Herman Stern were defeated for re-election, and that pretty much brought an end to substantial Socialist Party influence in Berkeley's city government. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the American Socialist Party, including Stitt Wilson, looked on in horror as the European Socialist parties failed to resist the rush to war. Stitt Wilson and the Socialist Party campaigned for the U.S. to remain neutral. His views changed, however, possibly due to his close ties to Great Britain. And at some point between the end of November 1916 and the beginning of February 1917, and I haven't been able to pinpoint it yet, he resigned from the Socialist Party. He declared that Woodrow Wilson was right, that America needed to help make, quote, make the world safe for democracy, and that while he remained a socialist, socialism was not possible without democracy. In 1917, he ran for mayor as an independent this time, opposing not only the incumbent, but several other candidates, including the one from the Socialist Party. He made the runoff and was immediately subjected to a major attack on his patriotism. After America entered the war, U.S. Army intelligence encouraged the creation of civilian vigilante organizations to monitor opposition to the war effort. One of these on the West Coast was the Nathan Hale Volunteers, founded by a man who had ties with the railroad police. Their recruiting material advertised that, quote, Nathan Hale volunteers never betray their identity, unquote, which means that in the name of patriotism, they would denounce their neighbors, co-workers, and anybody else they didn't like. This individual, Frederick Hughes, called on Stitt Wilson and Socialist Party member Elvina Beals, who had made the runoff for city council, to withdraw from the race because of their association with socialism and, quote, the red flag of revolt, and that their election would undermine the war effort. When they refused, Hughes attacked Stitt Wilson for having sent a telegram the previous year criticizing militarism and preparedness. This was followed by letters from Berkeley Society women suggesting that Stitt Wilson's political creed would prevent him from supporting the president in the war. Stitt Wilson responded vigorously, pointing out that in the 1916 presidential election, Woodrow Wilson had run on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," and that impugning the patriotism of those with different opinions was destructive of the democracy that America was supposed to be fighting for. Quote, I know of no more deadly and dangerous thing that could occur in the nation at this hour than a spirit on the part of anyone or any group to assume that they alone are the patriots and to impeach the loyalty of their fellow citizens. Men and women of Berkeley, I challenge this sort of thing in our midst, and I urge you to flee from it as you would from a plague. In the end, he was defeated by a margin of only 124 votes out of 12,400. In other words, he got 49.5% of the vote in the mayoral election. It's impossible for me to judge whether he lost because of the attack on his patriotism or whether he may have actually come closer to election because of his strong response to the citizens of Berkeley and their need to decide what kind of town they really wanted to have. After losing the election, Stitt Wilson toured California cities giving what he called an Institute of Democracy, a series of 4 speeches in support of the war and the sale of war bonds. In brief summary, it would go like this. Rivers of blood are flowing to defeat autocracy. Democracy must be based on the teachings of Jesus Christ, who demonstrated the sacredness of the lowest human being in contrast with the hierarchical teachings of monarchy. Democracy is realized through cooperation and caring, and not through competition and every man for himself. In other words, he was trying to use the nation coming together in wartime patriotism to lay the groundwork for a change in societal values after the war was over. An occasional newspaper editorial grumbled about his socialist past and about the socialistic implications of his message. But telling people that their boys were fighting in the sacred cause of democracy to build a world based on the teachings of Jesus was extremely popular. Civic leaders congratulated themselves in the newspapers for having secured him as a speaker in their town. Meanwhile, in September 1917, Gladstone Wilson joined the Army. As Stitt Wilson's campaign driver, he had picked up a fair number of speeding tickets, which may explain why he went into pilot training. On September 7, 1918, he was killed in a collision with another airplane at Mather Field. Said J. Stitt Wilson, "If the promotion of Gladstone Wilson to higher service will add some inspiration to the cause of world democracy, his soul will rejoice, and so shall we with him." After a brief break, Stitt Wilson threw himself into speaking, and when the war ended 2 months later, he said, "The Great War is over. May history sow fruit that none of these noble boys shall have died in vain. We shall live to fulfill their holy sacrifice." In January 1919, Stitt Wilson returned to the Methodist Church and took a position as traveling field secretary for the YMCA International Student Committee, touring colleges and universities all over the U.S. The YMCA Student Committee was run by social gospel supporters, and throughout the 1920s they employed speakers who challenged the conservatism of the times. Stitt Wilson's talks had titles such as "The War on Democracy, They Shall Not Have Died in Vain," "Conference on Christian Democracy and World Responsibility," and most often a series of 4 talks called "Constructive Christian Democracy." These were updated versions of his Institutes of Democracy, efforts to persuade the next generation of college students to live up to the ideals for which his son had died. He also gave speeches in support of the League of Nations as a necessary way to realize the ideal of a world without war. After the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty for joining the League of Nations, Stitt Wilson's speeches took a darker and more combative tone, warning that the future of Western civilization was at stake and that only a drastic change in the structure of property rights and human rights could save it. He continued to lecture at colleges all over the U.S. several months each year until his retirement from the Y in the 1930s. At this point, I want to go back a few years and pick up the story of his daughter, Violette Rose Wilson. During the period from 1915 to 1926, Violette probably received more national newspaper publicity than her father for her feminist beliefs. In 1915, when she was 20, She was photographed wearing riding pants in protest over laws banning wearing clothing of the opposite sex. She entered UC Berkeley in the fall, but dropped out 7 months later, saying she needed to free her soul. In a nationally reprinted interview, she said, among many other things, "The vast majority of men, especially businessmen, want a pretty little plaything for a wife. They have no intellectual interests in common with their husbands. They are toys, pets." Interviewed about his daughter dropping out of school, Stitt Wilson responded, "She is a girl of the new type. She has rebelled, and her mother and I are heartily in sympathy with her." In May 1916, while Stitt Wilson was away campaigning for women's suffrage in Iowa, Violette wrote, produced, and starred opposite her brother Gladstone Wilson in 4 dance dramas that were performed with orchestral accompaniment before several hundred people at the Wilson home, actually on the lawn outside, as a benefit for the Berkeley Free Dispensary, the free clinic of the time. She announced that she had found her soul in the dance and in drama, and moved to Los Angeles, where she took a leading role in a play at the Little Theater. And on December 31st of 1916, she married her leading man, Irving Pichel. She had an active and successful career on stage, and every time she visited her parents in Berkeley, the Oakland Tribune sent a reporter to ask her about the state of her soul. In 1920, they moved back to Berkeley, initially into the Wilson family home and then into a house next door. Irving Pichel became co-director of a theater company, often co-starring with Violette in such plays as George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman and Pygmalion. In 1926, a nationally syndicated article featured Violette Wilson Pichel under the heading, "This Woman is Mother of Two, Cook, Actress, and Architect," with pictures showing her putting on makeup and also working on architectural drawings of the new house she had designed for her family. The house was never built, however, because in May, Irving Pichel quit the Berkeley Playhouse in a dispute with his board of directors and moved to Santa Barbara, then on to Hollywood, where he became a successful movie director. 2 years later, in 1928, Violette visited Berkeley with her 2 children, a third due in a few months, and told the reporter, "My soul, it's in my children and my home, the 2 most precious things in the world. If women could only know where happiness lies, they would forget all this talk about their independence and cast aside all these ultra-modern theories as mere nothings of an unreal world." Still, she didn't give up the theater. The next year, she and Irving co-starred in George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan at the Berkeley Playhouse. By the way, if anybody here knows how to contact anyone from the Pichel family, please let me know. Their son, Julian Pichel, had Stitt Wilson's autobiographical manuscript and lent it to a history student, Michael Hanukkah, for his master's thesis back in 1972, and nobody knows where it is today. I would love to find it. When the Great Depression hit in 1930, Stitt Wilson likely felt that his time had finally come. He returned to his Social Crusade and was in great demand as a speaker. From the New York Times, September 19th, 1931, just the headline, a long headline, "Church Group Asks Socialization Plan. Buck Hill Falls Conference asserts human values must get first preference. Stirred by Stitt Wilson, economist challenges churches to lead the world in obtaining new economic structure." He returned to the Socialist Party and was elected chair of the California Central Committee, ran as the socialist candidate for Congress in 1932 and received 23% of the vote. Among his many activities, in July in Santa Rosa, he spoke to a rally of 1,000 farmers opposing a bank that was foreclosing on a ranch owned by a retired minister. Stitt Wilson said in part, "President Roosevelt has urged that foreclosures be delayed, and in fighting this sale, we are only backing the president. We showed them in Iowa, and we will show them here." He urged the farmers to attend the upcoming foreclosure sale with their pitchforks. Governor Rolfe urged delay in the foreclosure, but the bank refused, stating that it was a matter of principle of whether there was to be mob rule or the law. On July 14th, with 1,000 people on the courthouse steps, a Superior Court judge blocked the sale. In late 1933, Upton Sinclair, best-selling novelist and perennial socialist candidate, changed his registration from socialist to Democrat to run for governor in the Democratic primary on a platform of End Poverty in California, the EPIC campaign. Stitt Wilson followed suit and campaigned for Sinclair throughout Northern California. And by the way, Irving Pichel put on a fundraising play for Sinclair down in Pasadena. Sinclair won the Democratic primary but lost in the general election, and Stitt Wilson continued working with the EPIC organization, supporting self-help and cooperative efforts by the under and unemployed. Stitt Wilson broke with EPIC in 1936, however, when Sinclair decided to run his own slate of delegates to the Democratic National Convention in opposition to the Roosevelt delegates. During the Second New Deal of 1935-36, Roosevelt had signed the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act and greatly expanded public employment for the unemployed with the Works Progress Administration, for which we owe several of Berkeley's parks and a number of public buildings. Stitt Wilson argued that not only did Roosevelt deserve support, but that the likely alternative to Roosevelt was fascism. After the convention, he worked for the California Democratic Committee, giving speeches in support of Roosevelt's plan for changing the Supreme Court. He continued to be active in promoting progressive policies within the Democratic Party for the remaining years of his life, including campaigning for a third term for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940. In 1940, also his brother Ben died at his home in Berkeley. Stitt Wilson worked with the Berkeley branch of the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, supporting the Lend-Lease program with the United Kingdom. His last public speech came on May 30th, 1942 at the Fellowship of Humanity in Oakland on the war, the victory, and the peace. He died at the age of 74 at his home in Berkeley on August 28th, 1942. It's hard to say whether he had much influence on the politics of Berkeley as such after his time in government, but his contribution to the social gospel did live on to some degree, as the Kurt Vonnegut Powers Hapgood story shows. And a future mayor of Berkeley, Lawrence Cross, moved to Berkeley in 1924 to become pastor of the North Bray Community Church. He was a liberal Democrat who was elected mayor twice, serving from 1947 to 1955. When he arrived in Berkeley, J. Stitt Wilson gave Cross one of the last remaining copies of his book, How I Became a Socialist and Other Papers. That copy is actually out on the display table there. The book is extensively underlined, especially passages relating to the social implications of various Bible passages, suggesting that Cross used Wilson's book to help with his own sermons. So I'll stop it there and throw it open for questions and yes, Nancy.
It was a wonderful talk, thank you. And could you just repeat the name of the Tsarist army colonel who refused? I want to find out more about that guy.
Oh, yes. Fyodor Postnikov. He later changed his name to Fred Post. And then, because he published a number of books under his original name, went and changed it back. There's actually a copy of, let's see, what was it? There was a My Little Cousins series, I think it was called. And so he published the My Little Cousin the Cossack in this series about the peoples of the world. But a fascinating man. I intend to say a good deal more about him in the book.
Wonderful story.
Yes.
That was really fascinating. Do you think that when Stitt Wilson was mayor of Berkeley, was at that time was Berkeley viewed by everybody else as this weirdo place? And of course, in Berkeley, you might have a socialist mayor, but no such thing would happen anywhere else. Or was it still more, was it more normal back then?
Not at all. At that time, Berkeley was I think the 5th largest city in California.
Yes.
The largest were, of course, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, and then I think Pasadena may have been slightly larger than Berkeley at the time. They were roughly comparable.
Sacramento.
Oh, Sacramento, thank you. And it was regarded as an extremely respectable place. It was the home of the University of California at a time when really only, for the most part, the elite attended the college. And it was a dry town, if only because state law said that you couldn't have alcohol within a mile of the university. In fact, there was ongoing controversy about whether it should remain allowable for liquor stores in Oakland to deliver packages to homes in Berkeley. So it didn't at all have, it certainly had Berkeley Bohemia and was known for, its artists and theater and architects and so on. So, but it was within the context of kind of upper middle class advanced thinking and not the kind of image that Berkeley later developed in the 1960s and 70s. His basic view, whether it was historically correct or not, was that the picture that he would give really almost throughout his life when he was giving speeches was there was this Roman Empire, which was, of course, an empire. It was an autocracy. And there was this man, Jesus Christ, who gave infinite value to each human being and each human soul. And that, in his view, was the beginning of what would become the eventual passage to democracy and hopefully to socialism. And that there had been succeeding revolutions, that slavery had been ended, that there had been America had declared its freedom from Great Britain and started on the path to creating democracy. Slavery had been ended, and now it was time for yet another peaceful, in his case, revolution that would replace the rule of the trusts and of wealth with a society based on, and an economy based on cooperation.
But he was tracing that back somehow.
And he always traced it back. He always traced it back to the Bible. The social gospel had there's kind of several ways in which the social gospel was based. One is that the Hebrew prophets were calling for human freedom. One of Stitt Wilson's speeches that he published as a pamphlet was called Moses, Greatest of Labor Leaders. The second is, of course, Jesus Christ the man, the son of a carpenter, who portrayed the infinite worth of every human being, whether they were the lowest of the low. And the third is the notion of the divine immanence, that God is there throughout the universe and there in all of us, very much think of the Quaker view of the divine light, that every human being has access to the divine light, and that God is there for all of us if only we would touch on that. This had the, I think, aside from all the positives, this also helped lead him into a long involvement in New Thought, which was a perspective developed back around 1900, actually a bit earlier, where there was a belief that you could engage in mental healing of physical ills, and kind of, I think, very similar to Christian Science, although not quite as explicitly Christian.
Could you talk a little bit more about who lived in Berkeley during Wilson's term as mayor? I mean, besides the university people who else?
Oh, sure.
Town?
Yeah.
I mean, I understand that most, African Americans, for example, came much later during the war, but who was here in 1911?
Well, Berkeley was somewhat split. You had an industrial area in West Berkeley, and basically a large working class population in West and Central Berkeley, and then you had a more middle class population kind of in the area around the campus. The existence of the city of Albany is to some extent a tribute to the cultural as well as class conflicts there, because Albany did not want to, the people of Albany decided that they wanted access to bars and saloons and alcoholic beverages, and did not wish to be merged into the city of Berkeley with its limitations. In fact, and they actually had a couple of local prohibition campaigns in Albany that Stitt Wilson participated in, and they lost.
So what is now Albany was part of Berkeley, and they
No, it was an unincorporated area. Berkeley and Berkeley expanded a little bit. And I don't remember the details of the history there, but I know there was an idea of incorporating Albany, and it didn't succeed.
And I may have missed it earlier, but you said there was the state law about no alcohol sales within a mile of UC campuses, singular at the time, but there was also a Berkeley ordinance about alcohol sales?
Yes, and again, I don't know the details there. I'm still in the middle of my research. I've only actually just completed sort of outlining his life, and now I have to go back and get into...
Yeah. Well, the thing about sales within a mile of campus came down until pretty recently.
Yeah.
It seems to me it was that way when I was going to Cal. You had to go down to Brennan's or someplace to be far enough away.
Yeah, in fact, some enterprising young Cal student got free drinks for life for proving that it was 1.1 miles away from campus.
West Berkeley Ocean View was not drying.
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. One thing where I might note is that the research that I've been doing is really only made possible in recent years, because it requires tracking Stitt Wilson through dozens and dozens of newspapers in almost every state of the union. And without having historical sources where newspapers have been put online and made searchable, it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to find most of this stuff. Now, that said, I think one of the things that's very unfortunate is that the Library of Congress project to put American newspapers online up through 1923, which is the copyright sort of cutoff point, and the California Digital Newspaper Archive effort to do the same with California newspapers seemed to have come to a complete halt several years ago with all the cutbacks in government funding available. And instead, what is available is that thanks to the incredible number of people who are interested in pursuing family genealogy, there are private companies that are indeed putting millions of pages of American historical newspapers online, including big chunks of the Berkeley Gazette, for example. But people have to pay annual or monthly subscription fees in order to access that information. So on the one hand, it's wonderful that it's available. On the other hand, it's a classic example of taking something that was developed through a social process, which is to say the internet and the World Wide Web, and proceeding to privatize access to knowledge and make it a profit-making enterprise. And I think we all know what Stitt Wilson would say about that. Yes?
In the case of the Gazette, you can point the finger at the Berkeley Public Library. They're the ones who gave it away to newspaperarchive.com.
Well, let me say that it's better to have it available through newspaperarchive.com than not have it available at all. My complaint is not that newspaperarchive.com, has copied and digitized it. I actually wish they'd finished the job because, for example, they don't have 1912 up yet. But what I wish is that the California Digital Newspaper Archive, which was a public effort out of the universities, would have had the resources to put up the Berkeley Gazette and lots of other local newspapers. There are amazing things that were going on. For example, Pasadena did succeed in creating its own electric power company. And during that period, Pasadena elected a socialist mayor. He was not a Socialist Party mayor. He was a sort of eccentric millionaire who believed that socialism would ultimately be the appropriate kind of way to organize an economy. And Pasadena succeeded in developing a public electrical system where Berkeley did not. And I would love to be able.
Do you remember? Oh, it doesn't matter.
I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Was it in the same era? Around the
Yes,
same
oh,
time?
absolutely. It was, I think he was even elected the same year. It was, I think that his last name was Thumb, and he made his money from inventing sticky flypaper.
A contribution of mankind.
Yeah, in the back.
Here at the Berkeley Historical Society in our photo archives, there are 2 or 3 pictures of something called the Socialist Band. Have you run across any of that? Berkeley Socialist Band. Have you ever ran across anything with Stitt Wilson in them?
No, I haven't.
Marching band or something?
Yes, it is a
Absolutely, marching band.
Yeah, other than newspaper mentions of them holding marches,
Yeah.
then, no, otherwise all the mentions are various places where people have reprinted the Historical Society's photo, which I hope to do also.
Just curious.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
would you say the name of the daughter that became a silent movie star again?
Okay. Gladys Viola Wilson, when she was in England, changed her name to Viola Barry.
Oh.
And she became, she was a star in, I don't know, many 30 or 40 movies.
Oh.
They really turned them out in the silent movie era. And she seemed to have somewhat of a specialty on movies of Jack London novels. The one I've seen the most publicity about was her appearance in the movie version of The Seawolf. But, yeah. Stitt Wilson actually appeared in a silent movie in 1915 called From Dawn to Dusk, which was a socialist movie, and it starred the Clarence Darrow, the famous labor lawyer. Unfortunately, no copies of that movie are known to have survived. And of course, it would be ironic if they did. I mean, it would be great, but then we would have silent movie footage of a famous orator.
Right, yeah, that's
And,
weird.
As far as I know, no one ever recorded Stitt Wilson. So that even though recording rolls and later discs and records existed for almost the entirety of his adult life, nobody seems to have ever sat him down and recorded 3 minutes of Stitt Wilson speaking on something.